Hello YouTube. This story seemed to have been forgotten forever. And no wonder all attempts to investigate this story have reached a dead end. The volunteer investigators who tried to follow the trail of the legend back in the 1960s had to admit defeat. Nevertheless, the story itself remains an intriguing and thought-provoking one. And maybe someday there'll be a continuation, who knows? To me, it demonstrates that there are societies and civilizations on this planet, or maybe inside the planet, or in the underground realms, that we know nothing about. But that's my opinion. However, right now, let me present you with the research of Mikhail Gerstein, Russia's top UFO researcher and author of numerous fascinating books, and also research of two other people I'll mention later, as well as some of my own research. So, in March of 1957, Mikhailov, chairman of the Astronomical Council of the USSR Academy of Sciences, obtained a letter, or received a letter, from a certain Olga Vasilyevna Maslenikova. I will add a few explanations where necessary to explain Russian and Soviet realities. So here's what she wrote. Dear comrade Mikhailov, I happen to live in the Kubань, in the Stanitsa, large Kazakh village of Giaginska. My landlord, the author means the owner of the village house where she and the Maslenikovs were renting a room, moved here together with his wife and children from the Stavropol province. He works as a shepherd. One day, he described to me and my daughter an interesting incident. He himself was told about this incident by his father, who had not been an eyewitness of this incident. It so happened that a strange apparatus flew into the village of the Stavropol province. Three dark-skinned men came out of it. They were breathing hard, making signs, and soon died since they could not breathe the air. The village residents quickly pulled apart the thing in which they landed. When I and my daughter asked, "What do you think? Is this a fiction or not?" he gave us an evasive answer. Who can know this? But actually he is certain that these were beings from another planet, maybe from Mars. That was my daughter's and my idea. We were astonished by the fact that they had died from suffocation, not from wounds or shock. The chairman of the Astronomical Council of the USSR Academy of Sciences, Professor Alexander Mikhailov, turned out to be a very polite person. In addition, in those years, it was customary to respond to any letters that came to Soviet state organizations. You write in your letter about the story you heard about unknown people who flew in from somewhere, who allegedly died because they could not breathe, he replied on March 23, 1957. You make an assumption. Based on this, are they from Mars? Of course, no one has come to us from Mars yet. And if such a flight had taken place, it would have been observed in many places, not only in Stavropol. As for the story you have heard, it is difficult to say when it was and whether there was anything like it at all. Maybe it was a balloon that was often flown in the last century. Air balloon. Is it possible that the balloonist? It is possible that the balloonist died, but all this is so vague and has, in fact, no credibility that it is impossible to answer anything clear. The letter and a copy of the answer remained in the archive of the Pulkovo Observatory, from where engineer Valery Burdakov got them 3 years later. Now, if you follow my research, you know that Burdakov, whom I was acquainted with and in correspondence with some 25 or so years ago, he was a Soviet scientist, a UFO researcher, an author of very interesting books, and an important person in the rocket and missile development of the USSR. He was a person who was not afraid to ask questions. The story of Maslenikova who spoke about a real apparatus, immediately attracted the attention of the engineer, because that's what he was at that time. Together with his colleague, engineer Yuri Biryakov, he decided to follow the trail. The engineers wrote to Maslenikova, but she was no longer alive. Olga Vasilievna's daughter answered them, "After receiving your letter, I immediately wrote a letter to our former landlord, the shepherd. I was hoping that he would answer me quickly, but I wasn't mistaken in my expectations. It will be difficult to find out anything about the question you're interested in without him, and that's why. He hails from Stavropol, and if I'm not mistaken, from the village of Otradnaya. Somewhere there was the landing of this unknown device. During collectivization, now that's the policy of the progressive Soviet socialism, when private land was confiscated from the people, and many of them were killed or put in concentration camps. The entire population of the village of Otradnaya moved, or rather was dispossessed and exiled, I will add, by the Soviet regime, to the Adygea Autonomous Region, in particular to the village of Georginskaya. Thus, modern residents of Otradnaya hardly know this story. Well, the researchers have eventually succeeded in establishing contact with Mitrofan Vasilievich Karpenko. His letter was as follows. Well, this certainly did happen long ago. Being a teenager, I liked to listen to old men's tales, and my father liked to tell them. Whether the story was truthful or legendary, I don't know. Neither do I remember in which year this happened, nor where, though my father could probably tell about this. The only thing I do remember is his assertion that a certain three men traversed what he called the sky frontier, flying in a machine, not in a balloon. Father never called the machine an airplane either. It was of unknown design. The men had no clothing. Their bodies were covered with hair, and they lived for only 3 days. Father stated that it was difficult for them to breathe with our air. The above accounts of the legend were published by Biryukov and Burdakov in the Soviet journal magazine Yuny Technik, the Young Technologist in English. 1962. 3 years later, there appeared in the Stavropol newspaper Молодой Ленинец some additional information. Having paraphrased the story published in the magazine, the anonymous author of the newspaper article went on. F.V. Chernyshov, a regional ethnographer from our Stavropol territory, made the acquaintance of engineer Burdakov and heard from him another account of the legend. It was Nikolai Pchelintsov, a Moscow schoolboy, who told Burdakov that in 1959 he had met with a 110-year-old man who had been living in Georgia. I'm speaking about Georgia, Georgia, in that part of the world. It was then a Soviet republic in the Caucasus Mountains area. It's now an independent state. The old man told Pchelintsov an interesting story that he had heard from his grandfather. The Georgian patriarch's account much resembled the above discussed story, but when asked where had the mysterious vehicle landed, the old man referred to some ravine near Elbrus mountain. And finally, there exists one more account that became known somewhat later. It's referred to as recently, but it's not recent in our times. It's, I would say, probably 10 years later. Anyway, it was published by the newspaper Anomalia as a supplement to Yuri Morozov's paper about this legend. Morozov, writer and lecturer, he was an independent researcher. And again, this was a letter, in the form of the letter that the story came. It was sent in 1985 by Irina Danilova, resident in Moscow, to the Commission on Anomalous Phenomena of the Committee on the Problems of Environmental Protection for the All-Union Council of Scientific technical societies. This was a very interesting, officially permitted paranormal research organization in my motherland, and I describe their activities in my books. Here's the text of her letter. For a long time, I have wanted to bring to light a story which probably has to do with space visitors that I heard when a child from my grandfather, but could not make up my mind since I knew the story only at second hand and without much detail. But one day I bought in the bookshop Staraya Kniga a file of the Unitechnik journal or magazine, one of its issues containing a story very similar to the one I know. Besides, my grandfather Afanasy Nikitich Pugach comes from the region that was the scene of the event described in the magazine. He too told of the arrival of three dark-skinned persons in something like an airplane. Their aircraft resembled a big arrowhead. The visitors looked like ordinary humans, but they were very thin and dark-skinned. My grandfather did not say that their skin was hair-covered, just that they were ill and having difficulty breathing. Local people did not know from what disease they were suffering, and therefore avoided approaching them. However, they brought to the visitors water and food, which remained untouched. When the visitors died, they were buried without cross or church ritual. Since nobody knew to which faith they belonged, the authorities were not informed about the incidents, since everybody feared an official investigation that could end up with a charge of murder. The aircraft had many parts made of some metal resembling silver, and subsequently the local people disassembled the machine using the metal for manufacturing household goods, in particular kitchen utensils and samovars. According to my grandfather, the event occurred at the very end of the last, that is 19th century. At a far later date, the Kurin Ataman, chief of the Kazakhs, heard about this story and sent a letter to St. Petersburg, to the Academy of Sciences, together with some preserved parts of the machine. But then the war between Russia and Japan broke out, and nobody came to them. Let us consider a hypothesis proposed in this connection by Valery Kukushkin, a well-known Russian anomalist and paranormal researcher and folklore collector. He got in touch with the paranormal phenomena researcher and author Yuri Nikolaevich Morozov, whom I mentioned before, and who had investigated this case extensively. In response to Morozov's investigation, Kukushkin sent him a manuscript of his work that was subsequently published in an abridged form. Below I will present the main ideas of Kukushkin's paper. So, Valery Kukushkin starts his analysis by examining the space traveler hypothesis of the incident. If the beings described in the legend had arrived from outer space, one could consider that their preparation for this visit was appallingly bad. They had neither space suits or even gas masks. Since this stanitsa, Kazakh village, residents quickly pulled apart their landing module, it means that the latter had a very insignificant margin of safety, corresponding more to a lighter-than-air craft than to a descent space capsule that is designed to operate under great dynamic G-loads. Parts of this aircraft were easily adapted for using in peasant households. At the same time, no intricate parts of the incomprehensible function were mentioned in the legend. Nothing strange or miraculous has been noted in the behavior of the visitors or in their equipment. Everything goes to indicate these were terrestrial people, Earthlings. As for the vehicle in which they arrived, Kukushkin comes up with an original idea. This was a parachute with a basket that had separated from an air balloon. Such primitive parachutes were in use in aeronautics starting from the late 18th century. Having witnessed the forced landings, landing of the aeronauts, the local people could compare with a big arrowhead either the parachute itself, if it had a hard cone-like frame, or the basket suspended from the parachute. Special attention is paid by the author of the hypothesis to the information that local people use some parts of the machine made from a silvery metal to manufacture kitchen utensils and samovars. Kitchen utensils, he reasons, include cooking pots, frying pans, bowls, that is, cylinders of different heights and bottoms. Samovars are also long cylinders with bottoms. Blanks for these kitchen utensils must have been soft enough to saw or to cut. They must have been not too thick, as well as taking soldier, otherwise soldiering would have been impossible. The best possible blanks might have been medium pressure oxygen cylinders. Such cylinders were in use in the late 19th century during high altitude balloon flights. Kukushkin lists in his work several alloys known by that time that resembled silver and could be used to manufacture oxygen cylinders. Where did the aeronauts or air travelers come from? The only sky frontier that the Russian Empire had in the Stavropol region was the southern one. The dark skin of the visitors, noted by the local people, also suggests a southern origin, so perhaps Middle East or Africa. Having analyzed the legend, Kukushkin concluded that the flight took place between 1830 and 1850, in those years. It was a significant period in the history of Egypt. Under the rule of Muhammad Ali Pasha, this country achieved considerable successes in the economic, cultural, and military spheres. The Egyptian ruler tried to free his country from its subordination to the Ottoman Empire. This led to a number of armed clashes. In the Battle of Nizib, summer of 1839, the Ottomans were defeated by the Egyptians. Kukushkin believes it is quite probable that the Egyptian army had got balloons, since Muhammad Ali Pasha was drawing extensively on European specialists in his military forces, primarily the French ones. Having made such an assumption, the author outlines the following hypothetical scenario. In the summer of 1839, or most likely somewhat later, in the fall or winter of that year, 3 Egyptians were making a reconnaissance flight in a balloon. A wind carried them off course to Turkish territory and then to the mountains. In this region, in fall and winter, the prevailing winds are from southwest to northeast, whereas in the northern part of the Caucasus, the winds usually blow from west to the east. Having climbed over the mountains, the aeronauts had to use oxygen cylinders for breathing, but the oxygen soon ran out. Breathing cold and rarefied air overstrained the aeronauts' lungs, their respiratory ducts becoming inflamed. Finally, the exhausted travelers that the mountain ranges had been surmounted, and they could descend. So they got over the mountain ranges and they could descend, but the release valve had frozen, and as happened more than once in the history of ballooning, and the aeronauts decided to bail out with a parachute. Eyewitnesses on the ground, not noticing the balloon that swiftly disappeared in the sky, described only the landed vehicle, namely the parachute and the basket. Kukushkin adds one more argument in favor of his hypothesis. If it had been an attempt to achieve a record for range, altitude, or time of flight, and the more so if it had been an air expedition, it would not have remained unnoticed by the media and historians. Organizers of such a flight would have made every effort to find the crew and the craft, but there was in fact no search and rescue operation. Therefore, its organizers had some grounds to conceal the flight, and a secret flight can have been only with a military purpose. The idea of Kukushkin is not without appeal. The author's approach to the problem is highly rational. All the details have been thought out and are mutually consistent. Nevertheless, this scheme of the sequence of the events is in fact unlikely. Oxygen cylinders were used in the 19th century only during high-altitude flights with scientific research purposes, the first ever known experiment of this kind being performed as late as 1875. Parachute jumps from balloons were considered for the whole 19th century only as a spectacular show. In the light of all this, it seems doubtful that a balloon meant for air reconnaissance could have been equipped with oxygen cylinders and a bulky built-in parachute, and that's according to Morozov. He did the analysis. Much less probable seems this idea when we consider the Egypt of the first half of the 19th century. There is no evidence at all for balloons being then in use in that country. Besides, even the author of this hypothesis admits that aeronautical history provides no example of a descent by a group of 3 aeronauts with one parachute. Just the same, the rational interpretation by Kukushkin of some strange motifs of the legend, the heart beating of the pilots, part of their aircraft made of a silvery metal, seems to outline an acceptable alternative to their ufological interpretation, meaning that they were an outer space UFO. In principle, the balloon hypothesis is reasonable and worthy of further elaboration. Well, I don't know who will elaborate further, but I'm not giving up hope. There is more to this story. What are the prospects of the legend's verification? More definite conclusions about the reality and nature of the event described in the legend can be drawn only on the basis of more reliable sources. As is evident from the foregoing, there is a good chance of discovering official documentary records, artifacts, parts of the aircraft, even possibly the grave of the pilots, but no practical investigation in these directions have up to now been conducted. Well, this is hardly inexplicable, though. We know virtually nothing about the exact location of the scene of the event. Which archives should be searched for this data also remains unclear. Now, I want to add some more information from the Gerstein research. Much in the legend of the emergency landing suggests that it may have terrestrial origins. Firstly, the villagers recognized the victims of the disaster as people, although strange looking. Secondly, the alien apparatus was too easy to understand, although all modern craft stories mention the incredible hardness and strength of the UFO material. And the strange skin color could be caused by oxygen starvation or some other effects of high altitudes on an ordinary person. But who could have built such a device in the 19th century, long before the advent of airplanes? Researchers found out about another crash, the roots of which may also go back to the century before last, almost by accident. Let me leave Mikhail's investigation for a brief moment. Here's what I heard a long time ago. The forests of Yakutia are full of mysteries, and since 1928 they have been hiding the secret of a UFO crash on Cat Cap Mountain, which means the ship fell in the Aboriginal language. That's one interpretation of the name of the mountain, by the way. The first terrible discovery was made by pilot Nikolai Aleynikov, who had an accident in the Yakut Mountains. After the crash, the pilot had to independently get out of the unexplored taiga forest. At that time, making his way through the expanses of the harsh land, he came across the remains of a hunter. Aleynikov examined the remains and found a blade next to the body. The artifact had a light weight, high strength, and was very sharp. Later, the pilot tried to find out from the aircraft designers what alloy the interesting find was made of, but the engineers could not determine the material. In those years, Soviet scientists were engaged in the development and research of light alloys. The pilot's interesting find was seized, and all research data was classified. So now let's go back to Mikhail Gerstein. In 1932, an expedition of geologist Stolyar left the Nezametny mine, which today has become the city of Aldan. The 700-kilometer journey along the Aldan and Uchur ridges was immensely difficult. Deer died unable to get food from under the icy crust. Snowdrifts blocked the passes, and each river harbored deadly secrets. But the risk paid off. The expedition discovered a new gold-bearing area. And not only that. About almost 40 years later, geologist Alexei Shpagin drew attention to several lines in the work of Stolyar titled Geology and Gold-Bearing of the Uchura-Chulbinsky district of the Yakut Soviet Socialist Autonomous Republic. It was published back in 1934. The researcher explained the origin of the name of the Cat Cap Ridge in this way. According to the story of the Tungus tribesman Martinov, the ridge is named after the Galets Cat Cap, where the word cat is an abbreviated Yakut keter, which means to catch on, and the kap is a corrupted word for ship. According to his father's story, an airship got caught on this Golets a very long time ago and crashed. And the Tungus tribesmen forged knives and palm tree knives from its iron skin, a kind of spearheads. That's what they did. The top of the Charchahan spring, where according to the story the ship fell, was passed by me. Special research for the legendary ship was not produced, did not take place. Apparently, it was in honor of this event that the Golets, now I'll explain to you, it's a mountain with a bare top, located at the sources of Charchahan spring, was named by Stolyar the Golets airplane. I certainly trust Stolyar's words about the Martinov story, as well as the story itself, Shpagin wrote later. A serious researcher, such as he was, in a serious scientific work, would not give a fictitious account about the etymology of the name Cat Cap and the Evenk, as that's the name, modern name for the Tungus people. Martinov could not invent the story because, according to the concepts of local residents, to invent means to deceive, and that's for them is just not possible. I judge about the latter on the basis of my personal long-term experience of communicating with the Yakut, Evenks, Nanai, and others during my work in the eastern Siberia and the Far East. But if Martinov's story is true, then what kind of airship could have crashed in a deserted region, hundreds of kilometers from large settlements? The work on the Cat Cap was carried out by Stolyar in 1932, Shpagin reasoned. The expression a long time ago is very vague, but one can think that it's not 2 years or 5 years. Consequently, the flight of the legendary airship took place at least in the 1920s, or more likely even earlier. The Cat Cap Ridge is located in the eastern part of the Aldan Shield, and from the Golets Cat Cap, an airplane, the distances to the nearest large settlements in a straight line are hundreds of kilometers. Small villages located close to the Ketgap Ridge, such as Chagda, Chulbi, Yagonam, and others, have now practically ceased to exist, and in the 1930s perhaps only pack trails connected them with the outside world. The Stolyara expedition reached the place where they were. It took them one month to reach the place of their further work. Mikhail Gerstein doesn't know much about the history of aircraft construction, as he says, but it seems to him that in the 1920s and even earlier, an airplane could hardly get into the area of the Ketgap Ridge. Maybe it was an airship? The self-expression airship, even if we assume that the Evenks were not familiar with the words airplane, or is more suitable for an airship than for an airplane. In addition, the concept of iron skin is hardly applicable to aircraft of that time. And that's what the airship that the Tongass people saw was covered with, iron skin. But the flight of the airship over the boundless and almost completely unknown spaces of Siberia could be caused in all probability only by errors in navigation. Well, the Soviet candidate of historical sciences, Tugalukov, suggested that we're not talking about an air, but about a river boat, a koche, which the Russian pioneers tried to drag from one river to another, but abandoned halfway. However, such vessels never had an iron skin. Another historian, a senior researcher at the Yakut branch of the Siberian branch of the USSR Academy of Sciences, Nikolaev, complained about the Yakuts' tendency to invent and spread legends. However, he also admitted that in the legend about the aircraft Anuchura, on the one hand, there must be some real clue with which the legend began. Which one exactly? Perhaps the legend is based on a real catastrophe or disaster that struck the curiosity of the taiga people, so to say. Until 1937, when the crew of Sigismund Levanevsky's plane disappeared, not a single Soviet plane or airship disappeared in the expanses of Siberia. But then, who could have crashed at the top of the Ketgap Ridge? German Zeppelin of the First World War, brought by jet currents into the depths of the continent? Or was it really a UFO? Unfortunately, no one started looking for the ship. It would be possible to take analysis of the metal from which knives and spearheads of local residents were made. Iron is precious in those parts, and we can assume that someone has preserved products made of heavenly metal or celestial metal. If nothing is done, then this UFO crash will forever remain just an unverified rumor. So, and I'm referring now to the very first one I have described to you in the Stavropol region. But, you know, I'm not sure if the people who crashed in Yakutia were not from the same place that the other ones crashed in Stavropol. As for the name Russian Roswell, it was used to describe the event by Yuri Morozov, so I took it as well. I stated my opinion in the beginning of this video. In the decades I spent doing investigation of paranormal phenomena of the USSR, Eurasia, Southern Africa, and other parts of the world, I have heard several stories of human beings who arrived on unusual advanced aircraft and were speaking unfamiliar languages. We're speaking, it took place 2 different centuries. We're not dealing with aliens, I believe. And again, I want to draw your attention to my research of the secret society, the 9 Unknowns. The link to the video is in the description. So, this is what I wanted to tell you today, and if you like my research, please support me. You will find the links in the description to this video, Please like my videos, subscribe to my channel, and please tell others. Thank you so much.